declare the experiment over, citing insufficient dramatic results. And as microphones crowded the stage, he began speaking about managing expectations and respecting medical realities. And that's when Margaret appeared at the top of the short staircase leading down into the atrium, gripping the railing, her legs shaking but defiant. And the entire room inhaled sharply as she took one step, then another, descending toward her son who had turned pale, utterly frozen, because the joke, he thought, he was controlling had become the moment that controlled him. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters forgot their questions. Ethan's rehearsed speech slipped from his hand as his mother reached the bottom step and stood before him without assistance. And in that suspended second, I saw a battle rage across his face. Pride, disbelief, shame, awe. And Margaret broke the silence by saying, "You tried to buy a miracle, Ethan. But this young man gave me something you never thought to offer. Time." And the words seemed to strike him harder than any accusation. The atrium erupted, not in cheers exactly, but in a collective recognition that something larger than a wager had unfolded. And Ethan, still frozen, finally managed to whisper, "How?" And I answered simply, "I washed your mom like she was my own." Because that was the truth stripped of spectacle. But the story didn't end with applause. It unraveled further, because that evening, Ethan came to our apartment unannounced, without cameras, without assistance, and sat at our chipped kitchen table across from my mother, asking her what she had taught me about strength. And for the first time, the millionaire who owned half the skyline looked like a son afraid of losing the only person who had ever loved him before the money arrived. He confessed that after his father died, he had equated success with invincibility, and when his mother's stroke shattered that illusion, he buried himself in expansion deals and acquisitions rather than sitting beside her hospital bed. And the challenge I threw in that hallway had forced him to confront the emptiness of his victories. True to his word, he funded the rehabilitation center, but he went further. He established a foundation dedicated to long-term patient-centered therapy, insisting that dignity be treated as essential equipment, and he asked me to lead community outreach despite my lack of formal credentials, saying the city needed examples more than experts. I refused the title, but agreed to help, because I knew hero narratives can corrupt as easily as wealth. Months passed, and Margaret continued walking, slowly but steadily, sometimes with a cane, sometimes leaning on her son's arm, and every time she took a step in public, Ethan watched not like a CEO monitoring an investment, but like a child witnessing magic he finally believed in. Yet perhaps the greatest twist came a year later when investigative journalists uncovered that several of Ethan's early business practices had skirted ethical lines, exploiting legal loopholes that displaced small vendors, and the city turned on him overnight, calling him a hypocrite who had purchased redemption, and he stood at another podium, this time alone, and admitted fault, announcing restitution plans that would cost him millions. And when reporters asked what had changed him, he didn't mention stock prices or brand image. He said, "The day my mother walked, I realized power without compassion is paralysis. And whether people believed him or not, I saw the tremor in his hands that told me. Transformation is rarely comfortable." As for me, I returned to cleaning offices part-time, continuing to care for patients who couldn't afford private specialists, because miracles, I've learned, are rarely singular events. They are accumulations of ordinary acts repeated with extraordinary consistency. Sometimes strangers stop me on the street and ask if I truly believed Margaret would walk when I made that bold declaration, and I tell them the truth. I believed she deserved someone who wouldn't laugh at the possibility. And in a country as divided and distracted as ours, maybe that belief is the rarest currency of all. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Never underestimate the quiet power of service. Never confuse wealth with wisdom, and never laugh at hope when it stands trembling before you, because one day you might find yourself frozen, watching the impossible descend a staircase you thought no one could climb. And remember to subscribe for more stories that prove even in the loudest corners of America, the softest hands can change everything. Stop scrolling, because the story you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about money, power, and miracles in America today. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that prove hope is real and justice still has a heartbeat in this country. The day Ethan Caldwell laughed in my face was the day the entire city of Brookhaven learned that arrogance can collapse faster than a skyscraper in an earthquake. And I remember it vividly because the hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and defeat, and my mother hadn't moved her legs in 3 years. I had just finished another double shift cleaning offices downtown when I overheard Ethan. Yes, that Ethan Caldwell, the 32-year-old tech millionaire who bought half the waterfront and renamed it after himself, joking with his entourage about how some people just want miracles instead of work. And I don't know what possessed me, maybe exhaustion, maybe faith, maybe desperation. But I turned around and said, "I'll wash your mom, and she'll walk." And the hallway went silent, because everyone knew his mother, Margaret Caldwell, hadn't stood up since her stroke 2 years earlier. And he stared at me like I'd just challenged gravity itself. Then he laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed against the tile, and said, "If you can make my mother walk, I'll fund every dream you've ever had. But if you're mocking my family, you'll regret it." And I told him I wasn't mocking anyone, that sometimes healing doesn't come from machines or money, but from hands willing to serve. And that's when he made it public. Because men like Ethan never resist spectacle. Within 48 hours, the local news stations were buzzing. Social media was tearing me apart. Some calling me a fraud, others calling me brave. And all I had was my mother's wheelchair parked beside Margaret Caldwell's hospital bed as the city waited for a miracle or a humiliation. My name is Daniel Reyes, son of immigrants, janitor by trade, dreamer by default, and caregiver by necessity. And I never intended to challenge a millionaire in a hospital corridor, but life doesn't ask permission before throwing you into the spotlight. I had learned how to wash a body gently when my own mother's illness stole her mobility, how to speak hope into someone whose spirit had shrunk from the inside out. And when I looked at Margaret Caldwell that first day, I didn't see a billionaire's mother. I saw a woman whose eyes still burned with frustration at being trapped inside her own flesh. The agreement was simple on the surface. I would be allowed to care for her personally for 30 days under medical supervision. And if by the end she showed measurable improvement, Ethan would donate $10 million to the rehabilitation center that had nearly shut down for lack of funding. And if nothing changed, I would publicly apologize for exploiting false hope. What no one knew, not even Ethan, was that I wasn't betting on magic. I was betting on patience, dignity, and the quiet science of human connection. The first week was brutal. Margaret resisted me, her pride slicing through every gentle word I offered, and Ethan visited twice, each time with cameras trailing him like obedient pets, asking loudly whether the miracle worker had made progress yet. And I would answer calmly that muscles remember what minds forget, that circulation improves with touch, that healing is rarely theatrical. Meanwhile, my own mother watched the broadcast from our small apartment, whispering prayers in Spanish and telling me not to let rich men turn faith into entertainment. By the second week, something subtle shifted. Margaret began to anticipate my arrival, her fingers twitching when I massaged her arms, her voice, once brittle, softening into questions about my life. And I told her about growing up in a one-bedroom apartment, about translating bills for my parents, about learning that resilience isn't glamorous, but it's powerful. And she confessed that wealth had insulated her family so thoroughly that vulnerability felt like failure. And for the first time I saw, tears slipped down her temples as she admitted she feared dying without ever standing beside her son again. Ethan, however, grew impatient. He summoned neurologists from across the state, demanded updated scans, questioned whether I was using unapproved techniques. And each time the doctors explained that consistent therapy was indeed producing incremental improvement in nerve response, his jaw tightened as though progress offended him. Because if his mother improved under my care, it would mean something money couldn't buy had been right in front of him all along. Week 3 brought the first visible breakthrough. Margaret lifted her left leg half an inch off the mattress, a motion so small the cameras almost missed it. But the room erupted anyway, and Ethan froze. Not in awe, not yet, but in calculation, as though trying to determine whether physics had betrayed him. I didn't celebrate. I simply continued washing her gently, guiding her through exercises, reminding her that walking is as much memory as muscle. And that night she whispered, "Don't let him. Turn this into his victory." And I realized the true paralysis in that hospital wasn't in her legs, but in a family dynamic built on control. Outside the hospital, backlash intensified. Bloggers dug into my past, searching for scams. Skeptics labeled me manipulative. And yet donations began pouring into the struggling rehab center from ordinary Americans who said they believed in second chances. And I understood then that this story had outgrown us. It had become a referendum on whether compassion still mattered in a culture obsessed with status. Then came the twist no one expected. During a routine therapy session without cameras, Margaret stood, fully stood, holding on to the parallel bars while I supported her waist. And for 3 trembling seconds, she bore her own weight. No media, no Ethan, just us, and a stunned physical therapist who began to cry. And Margaret looked at me with fierce determination and said, "Don't tell him yet," because she wanted her son to see it not as a performance, but as a confrontation with his disbelief. The following week, Ethan scheduled a live press event in the hospital atrium, intending, so we assumed, to declare the experiment over, citing,